in this episode, in this show, we want to talk about how we destroyed money. And I'll say we, but how money was been destroyed, how fiat currencies led ultimately to Bitcoin. So we left the last show getting to the point of fiat currencies, paper money, and we just want to get into the world of banking. So can you talk to me about the birth of banks? Where did it start? Where did we first get the banks from?
So the early proto banks go back literally thousands of years, and the two primary functions are the provision of credit, so basically the manipulation of money over time, or just the ability to move money easier. So it's increasing the portability of money. And so you can find, for example, bills of exchange that were used on the Silk Road. So 1500 years ago, and there'd be someone sending money from Uzbekistan to China, and instead of bringing the gold with them, they're basically transferring a slip that could be exchanged for it later. And so whether you look at Babylon was a really early sign, like a period of kind of like some degree of banking, basically basic interest and loans and things like that. And so most of those systems started to kind of coalesce, but the banks, as we think of them in the modern form, didn't really come around until Europe over the past several centuries. And so in that period, as communication got a little bit quicker, as civilization got a little bit more developed, we went from this kind of channel-based proto-banking environment to these more banking institutions. And one way I characterize that in the book is to talk about increasing levels of negotiability. So in the early kind of proto-banking, before you get to the full banking stage, it's like you'd have a piece of paper that says Peter McCormack is entitled to 5 ounces of gold redeemed, and it would be between you and the issuer. And that's a non-negotiable instrument, meaning that if Danny somehow gets the paper, he can't go and get the gold. Now, over time, negotiability started to increase. So institutions became more flexible where, you could sign it over to Danny and then Danny could then retrieve it for the gold. And then eventually there were such institutions that were large enough in a region, like they were known enough that they could just issue a bearer asset, like a banknote that says whoever holds this can redeem this for a certain amount of gold. And so as these it's almost like watching the internet build. If you look at those graphs over time in the early decades, it was kind of like that in analog form as these different institutions would connect to each other, as some of them would grow and extend their influence, and you got more and more connectivity. And a lot of it was around from this channel-based kind of proto-banking environment to this more institution. You can almost call it like broadcast-based. When banknotes are out there and they're being able to use back, you're basically broadcasting the brand of the bank, the reputation of the bank, compared to doing business on these kind of networks of channels. So in banking, it's almost like Lightning came before Bitcoin, whereas of course in Bitcoin world, the base layer came first and Lightning's built on top of it.
Oh, so really banking came originally because people wanted to have somewhere safe to store their gold because they didn't want to store it at their house. Somebody would have a vault and protect it for them. And then these paper claims became the kind of promises for the ownership, which then became notes which you could use for trade. Is that what you're basically saying?
Well, so custody was a big early part of it, but then also the transfer. So like the having someone where and they're in a city, they're a money changer, they know certain connections in other cities, and if you want to send money to those other cities, you go to your local money changer, and they're this part of this network. So you can give your gold to them, not necessarily because you want to store with them long term, but because they can now basically transfer it quicker than you could physically and safer. So it's both the custody aspect and it's these different networks for trying to send value more quickly. And when those come together, you started to get the development of banking.
And so this paper money, what was really certificates rather than, and I guess the different banks would have their own certificates. It wasn't like a uniform kind of money, just different certificates that had different levels of trust, depending on how much you trust the institution that held it.
Yeah, and there were different environments for that. That's generally considered it's called a free banking environment, and that's where there's no centrally issued banknote, but instead banks, their gold is their money, and they have various certificates or claims that can be retrieved for gold, and larger, more well-known ones would, they're known to be accepted at a further distance, whereas smaller ones would be, or ones with weaker reputations might trade at a discount if they go too far away, or they might not be accepted, different levels of acceptability. But at the end of the day, they were all basically certificates for the retrieval of either gold or silver or similar.
Yeah, I remember Nick Carter wrote about this kind of era of free banking, and if my memory serves me, there were more bank runs. I think this is why we got the central banks, because individual banks had issues, but you would end up protecting yourself by holding reserves with different banks.
Yeah, they were heavily intertwined. And so one of the challenges is, and that's how this whole complexity started, is that the people that were custodying the gold, so that particular form of banking, they realized that no more than like 30% of people ever want their gold back at once. Um, and so they would say, well, we could do something with the gold instead of just hold 100% of it. So there are a lot of things that we deal with today that are still basic. They're still full reserve kind of custody environments for us. So, for example, if you have an ETF, they're holding a bunch of stocks and they're managing kind of the inflows and outflows of those stocks in this basket, and it's a full reserve vehicle, and you're paying a small fee for the administrator to do that. The same is true if you vault gold somewhere today. You'll pay a small fee for that. If you have a safe deposit box, obviously it's they're not doing anything with your assets while you're holding them in safe custody at the bank. But back then, because gold's fungible, so you don't have to get the same gold that you put in, unlike say things you put in your safe deposit box. The combination of fungibility and the fact that it was because gold is somewhat inconvenient, people didn't really want to retrieve it too often. They prefer to have it in the bank and be able to move around with the by signing something or by going to their banker. And so they realized that people don't withdraw it, and so they could start issuing either more claims than the amount of gold they had, or more specifically, they could start lending out some of that gold and trying to generate an income, which then allows them to eliminate the fee that depositors have to pay, which makes it a more attractive product for them. But then it becomes an issue of risk, because then you have an environment where there's more claims floating around. And I think that that's how we can describe this initial path towards fiat currency, which is that gold's slow speed made a lot of people want to put it in a bank and centralize it, use these claims instead, and then that allowed for the proliferation of claims relative to gold. And whenever push came to shove, whenever that system would be tested or would break, you know, in the early times, you'd have to kind of just collapse back down towards the amount of gold in the system. But as this got so prolific, where there's just claims everywhere, whenever there's a problem, you'd instead err towards making the claims whole, even if it means breaking a gold peg or centralizing things more and more. And so it initially started out with central banks were formed because you always had these kind of crashes, this inherent fractional reserve instability problem, and then these central banks would come around and purport to solve the problem, but then they actually over time just further abstracted us more and more from gold until we just kind of lifted off and it detached entirely.
Isn't it funny that it doesn't matter whether it's one of these very early banking institutions, which is taking your gold and offering some form of custody, or whether it's Prime Trust with Bitcoin, the issues with fake claims or over claims, or the incentives for people to issue more claims for what they hold exist. There's like this perversion. It doesn't matter what the form of money is; it just exists whatever form of money that is being custodied.
Yeah, it's been a remarkable kind of trend of human history that whenever you have custody of something that's fungible, games get played with it. If you're storing non-custodial things, it's much harder for the people running it to mess around. But when the system is fungible and it's not being tested very regularly, it allows these problems to build up until they're exposed. And it's literally it goes back to earliest history.
Yeah, it's and then that's again. I'm jumping ahead to the next episode. Sorry, Danny is going to be shaking his head at me, but that's why the ability to self custody with Bitcoin is such a revolutionary part of the evolution of money.
Yeah, because historically, throughout all these eras, you could self custody gold, but generally you wouldn't want to do it in large amounts, and so people were, they weren't forced to put their money into banks, but many of them happily did because they wanted, professionals to be able to custody that. in a way that they can't, and they expect it to be safe. And what's powerful about Bitcoin is it's the first asset where you can, really rake ownership of that asset up and spread it around, not in a legal sense, but in a literal sense. So by having like multi-sig, for example, or collaborative custody, you can have it so that even fairly large amounts you can still custody safely and inexpensively.
Okay, can we talk about the advent of double bookkeeping? Double entry bookkeeping. How did that actually change the game with banking?
So it allowed for more complex financial arrangements. So instead of just these channel-based proto banking, the banker would have this elaborate set of assets and liabilities, and that would allow them to basically do more complex financial arrangements, mainly that whole fractional reserve lending model that they would do. And when you go back and look at, say, the history of European banking, it's really this development of like very detailed note taking, very very intricate records, and that's what was a fairly new thing. Now, obviously, records have gone back very far. Like if you go back to ancient Babylon, for example, you'd have those clay ledgers. And even speaking about custody, they had laws around custody and things like that. That's kind of the earliest sign to this stuff. So in some sense it stretches back forever, but that's the single entry bookkeeping. And so when you get to that more modern era of having two sets of books that reconcile, it just allows for more complex arrangements. And that's part of what allowed the European financial system to flourish, because until that period, Europe was kind of a financial backwater. Most of the financial innovation was happening in large part throughout the Muslim world, because that was more centered around the Silk Road type of environment. So along in ancient times, it was along the Silk Road, and then it was during the age of kind of the golden age of Islam, and then Europe was this kind of financial backwater. And as Muslim traders would interact with them over time, some of that brushed off. But then they made certain advancements once they actually kind of caught up to speed, and they proliferated this modern type of banking.
But did that also lead to this kind of explosion of fractional reserve lending?
Yes, because that's what enables these games to be played at a much larger scale. So you'd always have, prior to then, challenges of custody. It's not like they invented problems with custody, but they institutionalized it, and they allowed for this more structural proliferation of claims relative to the amount of underlying, because it's like you're juggling all the time. You're keeping multiple balls in the air. You have this complex set of books, and it's based on probabilities that most people are not going to want to pull their money out at once.
Our mutual friend Caitlin Long, she wants to, has been trying desperately to establish a full reserve bank, and we know that she's come up against challenges for that, which seems crazy. But we know why she wants to do it. But at the same time, having put this book together, what is your opinion now on having fractional reserve banking? Because there are people who will defend it. They'll say, well, two versions. They'll say that it is good, it is required as long as you operate with good risk models, is absolutely fine. And then others say I think as Nick Carter said, you can't stop it anyway. Even if you wanted to, you will have people who create leverage within systems. But what's your view now, having written this book on fractional reserve lending?
So I'm partially in the camp that you can't really stop it is the problem. The incentives were clearly too strong, because full reserve banking, I think another way of just describing it is proper duration matching. When people hear full reserve, that can be a little bit misleading. It doesn't mean that banks don't do any lending. It just means that the lending that they do is with capital that is not simultaneously promised to be liquid to someone else. So if a bank makes a loan, say a 2-year loan, that'll be supported by someone had basically deposited a time deposit, so it's say a 2-year certificate of deposit or longer, and then so they're putting their money in. They understand that they can't get their money, or at least can't easily get their money for the next 2 years, and that's being lent out in the meantime. And fractional reserve banking ultimately is you have these demand deposits, so people think they can get their money back anytime, and on a one-on-one basis they can, but the money's not all there. It's lent out in these more liquid, arrangements. And so I think on one hand, I'm firmly in the camp that duration matching makes sense. That if you're running a financial institution, that duration matching would ideally make sense. But when we see that it's not what developed in basically any country. Anytime this arose, they'd instead end up doing fractional reserve and then regulating around fractional reserve. and sometimes not even allowing, in this case, full reserve banks to exist. I think it's one of those things where, again, if we were to rerun this multiple times, we probably would end up with fractional reserve banking multiple times because the tendency and the incentives point towards that. I think, especially in this current era. So I think if you had, for example, going back to the, I guess, part three, but if you had a Bitcoin world, if there's less abstraction and if the underlying is convenient to move around, then the incentives for fractional reserve banking are much weaker. But in this environment where gold is slow, and therefore people want the claim for it, they want the abstraction of it, or in this world where the underlying unit, the fiat currency unit, is inherently flexible, so you can always print more if you need it. Both of those types of money seem to err toward fractional reserve banking over and over again wherever they pop up.